celebrations of the end of World War II.
Very significant. I'll start off my comments with
Really?
mentioning them. Very significant.
Even though our dear leader, or what is his name now? What is his? He was a no-show. He was disinvited. I can't remember.
He was certainly not disinvited. Not
just-
disinvited. The
he
Russians
was-
would have been happy to have him there.
But-
But that doesn't, I don't think that changes anything significantly.
Really?
I have clear views on that. I just got a paper I just submitted yesterday on the Russian thinking about the Korean Peninsula. So I'm very in tune to that issue.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, this is an opportunity.
Well, they're rather isolated, but I'm going to play up the significance of the Sino-Russian relationship,
Right.
which I've been doing for a while, but the summit was very significant. And I'm going to argue that the U.S. Japan summit was extremely important too, so that the lines are being drawn.
And there are different lines. That's the interesting thing, right?
No, I'm thinking that the middle powers are dropping out, that they don't have leverage anymore. They're losing it. I'm going to talk about that today.
That's very interesting.
So
Yes.
South Korea, I've just written a paper too, that'll be put out later in the week,
Yeah.
on South Korea's limitations of its middle power diplomacy.
And you just said that you believe that they're actually a Marshall Plan.
Right. They have 6 themes that they've pushed, and I think on all 6,
15 in the
they
note,
have,
but she just said 10 to 15.
They've exaggerated what they can accomplish, and they're in trouble.
I think if we go for 10, that's fine. It'll give people more time for questions.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shihoko Goto. I'm the Northeast Asia Associate here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all very much for coming. We're going to get started. I should add that this session, as have all the previous sessions, have been live webcast, so we do want to start in a timely manner. For those of you who were here in the morning, you know that the discussion was very much focused on identity, ethnicity, and the impact of history on governance. This session will focus on how broader national identity and national identities are changing, and whether a convergence of a collective national interests can allow the development of new pan-regional initiatives. And I think it's interesting to look particularly on the economic front and to see whether current proposed regional economic architectures, especially in the trade realm, not just TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but also other alternatives such as RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Deal, whether those types of initiatives can strengthen ties amongst Asian nations. But of course, we need to look also at the prospect for security cooperation. Those of you who were in the morning session will recall that Ambassador Roy made a big call for greater cooperation on the security front amongst Asian nations. And I hope today's discussion will focus a little bit more about what kind of alternatives there are, if there are any, to a US-led hub-and-spoke network of alliances. So here to discuss these very big themes are a diplomat, a sociologist, and a former US Pacific Command advisor. And I'd like to have our discussion started off with Gil Rosman. You have his full bio here, but I would like to highlight the fact that he was a former Wilson Center Fellow. He's also currently a Senior Fellow with FPRI's Asia Program, and he's also the Editor-in-Chief of the ASEAN Forum. So if, Gil, you can start off the conversation.
Thank you, Shihoko. I used to, as a professor, have a long-term perspective and think in terms mainly of decades. In fact, I've just edited a book that will have a book launch next week on misunderstanding Asia decade by decade over the last 50 years. I worked on regionalism after the end of the Cold War, and then I switched to a 2 or 3 year time span and looked at how things changed very more frequently. Now, as the editor of a journal, online journal that comes out every 2 months, I've developed a 2-month time span. So now I will talk about things that I think are very significant in the last 2 months or less that are reshaping the regional order. And here at the center of my attention are the two big, essentially, summits. Of course, the Abe-Obama summit and the Putin-Xi Jinping summit gathering in conjunction with the 70th anniversary victory parade in Moscow. And I think there were several messages that came out of each summit that drive us to the notion that we're heading to a much more polarized order. The one message, I'll start with the Putin-Xi summit. There was an economic message that the Silk Road economic belt and the Eurasian economic community, in other words, Sinocentrism and Russellcentrism, are compatible and can be joined together. Not an easy decision, but I think that's where Russia had to go after initially being concerned about what China is offering. So that was contrasts with the Abe-Obama push for TPP, and we see more of a sense of two economic orders. On the military side, I see the Putin-Xi summit as upgrading their military ties, as seen in arms sales, military exercise in the Mediterranean Sea, the way issues are treated, and even what I see as the implicit theme of, despite Kim Jong-un's absence, the overlapping view about how to deal with North Korea, with denuclearization important but not primary. Now, Russia is putting less pressure, is more engaging, is more eager right now, and China has a plan where it's putting more pressure, although in recent months China has upped its support for North Korea substantially, according to the latest reports, and the economic pressure from last year has been seriously reduced. But so on the economic military side, of course, we see the U.S. Japan alliance strengthening with an emphasis on freedom of navigation, new guidelines, a global alliance, and all of that came to the forefront in Shangri-La over the weekend with the back-to-back speeches by the defense secretary emphasizing their views of the South China Sea in contrast to the Chinese view. So I think that this military divide is strengthening. Finally, coming to Shioko's theme, and the theme, I think, a big theme for today's session, national identities. The history dimension, as a big part of national identities, particularly in this 70th anniversary year, is at the center of the Sino-Russian intensified partnership, quasi-alliance. That is a similar outlook on the danger of color revolutions, on now viewing the Cold War in overlapping ways, and the significance of 1945, and preserving the framework, their understanding of the way the world emerged after World War II, holding down the rise of Japan. Russia has now reaffirmed its thinking, revised even its thinking about Japan, stressing that it goes along with China's view about the danger of Japan revising the world order that was set up in 1945, which is a pretty strong attack on Japan's effort to build up its military and do some other things. And meanwhile, their sense that what would have happened was really a division of the world after 45. It's a very different interpretation of the outcome of the war from what we generally see in the United States. And they're playing on this, and what we'll see in September 3rd, when Xi is the host and Putin comes, with the possibility that Kim Jong-un will be there as well, and Park Geun-hye has to attend, Abe, very unlikely presence, with a much more of a stress on historical elements of national identity. So, and meanwhile, we got the identity theme in the Abe Abe-Obama summit being played up as well, despite the distracting information about history, which drew much of the public attention, and of course was South Korea's big focus. But I don't think that is the big message from these summits. It's not Japan's revisionist history that's at the center of attention right now. It's the Chinese-Russian push for an interpretation of how to deal with the legacy of 1945 and the U.S.-Japan agreement about universal values and fighting against the revisionist tendencies in coming from China and Russia. So that is, I would call, consolidated bipolarity with the potential of leading to a new Cold War. Russia sees there is one now, including in Asia. China refuses to accept that term, but at any rate, we have to consider it as a possibility, although we must not simply think it's something like the first Cold War, something very different in a lot of respects. Now, what are the implications of that? First of all, we start with Japan and Russia, because those are the countries that are becoming more allied with their partners. Both have accentuated their own independent identities in this process. Both are reverting to some elements of identity that others find disturbing. But that is sort of related, I think, to the frustrated multipolarity that both have been seeking. That they want to widen their diplomatic horizons. They want to establish better relations, including with each other, which even in the last 2 months, Japanese have been saying, we've got to keep trying to separate from Obama. And apparently it wasn't until just before the summit at the end of April that Abe finally decided that he could not proceed with his plan to invite Putin to Japan later this year. And that has led to a downturn in Japanese-Russian relations as Russia has, Sergei Lavrov has become much more critical of Japan, and I think this divide is going to be very hard to overcome. So I see both Japan and Russia talking big about how they are achieving something in their identity that's they've been aspiring to, they've been frustrated from speaking out about, but in fact, they're being drawn increasingly into a junior partnership that is reflective of the problems of the region, with the South China Sea and North Korea being the two most dangerous elements of that standoff right now. I could say much more about Japan and Russia as countries that are becoming polarized, but I'll leave that apart and then go on to the next part of the theme. I think that the countries and regions that have tried to speak out, emerge in the post-Cold War environment as centers of either bridges overcoming differences that exist, or new centers of regionalism, are losing their clout, even though they have continued to have aspirations. I will leave the ASEAN theme to Satu here, even though I think ASEAN is in real trouble now, and I will talk about South Korea, because South Korea has been stressing its middle power diplomacy, how it really has a chance to achieve a lot of things. Have a honeymoon with China and be the model ally of the United States at the same time. Establish a Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, which becomes the basis of a kind of Northeast Asia regionalism, parallel to some of the things that have been done in ASEAN. Have a Eurasian initiative to Russia. It's got trust politique with North Korea, all kinds of ambitious ideas and promising ideas in a different atmosphere. And right now I see them as Park coming to the United States in the wake of the Obama-Abe summit, more isolated and more in need of building up trilateralism with Japan under increasing pressure from the United States for that, making decisions that will alienate China, such as establishing the THAAD missile system or ballistic missile defense that China has warned South Korea against doing, alienating Russia, which Russia will use in a sort of blackmail way to strengthen its ties with North Korea. And so there's certain difficulties that South Korea has faced. And so I see this as a kind of abortive middle power activism. So let me conclude by stressing what is the foundation that is behind these developments. I see China as the driving force for the last 10 or 20 years in Asia, that it has a strategy, it's moved step by step with acceleration under Xi Jinping, and others have responded. So that's where I start. I see China and Russia drawing together on the basis primarily not of national interests, but of national identities. And that these identities are the legacy of their communist periods, still present in some ways in China, and that international relations theory has misjudged the driving forces and the most powerful currents that have operated in international relations in Asia consistently since the 1970s. And that what we now see is China and Russia, for reasons of strengthening their domestic national identities according to certain fundamental ideas, are drawing sharper lines against the outside world, even though they have different views now about how sharp those lines should be for the time being, and that is why we must be more conscious of identities in relations among countries that are struggling to overcome bilateral problems such as Japan and South Korea, and in the big struggle between China and Russia on the one hand and the United States and Japan on the other. Stop there.
Thank you, Gil. Before I turn to Richard, if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit about what you said about the importance of national identity on the one hand, and yet perhaps his issue of history is not as important as some countries make out. If you could clarify that a little bit.
Yes. Well, national identity in my analysis has 6 dimensions, and I go over each of them and I won't elaborate them on. This year happens to be a history year, and history is at the center of the way China and Russia are reinterpreting their national identity, so it's huge. But I say in the summit between Abe and Obama, we paid more attention to the history problems, particularly between South Korea and Japan, and how the United States was trying to manage them, than we should have in the context of what were the driving forces for this summit and its real significance. That's what I meant.
All right. Thanks. Richard.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Jacques and Rob and Shiroko for inviting me. I'm just back from Asia, and because of my jet-lag state, Jacques has given me permission to wander aimlessly about the region and to be even more incoherent than I usually am. So thank you, Jacques. I'm going to say just one word about architecture, and then offer my thoughts on North Korea, Maritime Asia, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And I think I hope in the process that I touch on the major themes of today's session. On architecture, I think the most useful way for me, at least, to think about that and regional architecture is as institutions that are created or become agents for solving problems. We do have entities, regional entities in East Asia that seem to be more about principles and process, and hopefully they will grow into problem-solving agents. But for me, the institutional part is the most important. Now, on North Korea, I think that this, at its core, is a bilateral issue between the United States and North Korea. And it's about the threat that North Korea is perceived to pose to South Korea and others, and the role of the United States as the guarantor of security in Northeast Asia. Two things happened in the 2002 to 2003 period. First of all, the United States, under the first Bush administration, was unwilling to meet bilaterally with North Korea on what, as I've said, at its core, was a bilateral problem. Second, because of the axis of evil formula and other things, China became afraid there was going to be a war. And so it moved to try and create regional mechanisms to address this problem. In the first instance, it was just to create a cover for the United States to have a bilateral meeting with North Korea. It started out as a trilateral meeting, and then China got lost wandering the halls, and it was North Korea and the United States were left, and they talked a little bit. But that evolved into 4-party talks and then 6-party talks. And the hope was that this could reduce the probability of war and actually induce progress. Now, I think that North Korea was never satisfied with what the United States and others were willing to pay for its denuclearization, which was quite a bit. And the United States and others were never willing to sacrifice what North Korea was demanding for denuclearization, and that was a lot. It's raised the question of whether North Korea was ever willing to accept denuclearization as the others understood it. I think that because of North Korea's current policies, the 6-party talks really don't have any problem-solving utility. I do think that it's always worthwhile for us to be willing to communicate with North Korea, but communication is not the same as negotiations. The looming task, I think, the problem that will have to be addressed is the need to contain the consequences of North Korea's continued nuclear programs. And the question is, does an architecture exist to do that? On to Maritime Asia. I think the core of the various problems we're seeing is China's quest for strategic depth to its east and its south. And if I were a Chinese military planner, I would want strategic depth. The problem, of course, is that it bumps up against the United States, which has always seen it as part of its Asian security strategy to be present militarily in East Asia, as well as economically, diplomatically, and other ways. There are a lot of other things that make maritime issues more complicated, territorial claims, the quest for energy security, domestic nationalisms, and the way that different countries, particularly China, assert their claims. Now, do we have an architecture to address this beyond bilateral diplomacy and a certain amount of coercive behavior? We do have UNCLOS, but the principles of UNCLOS are highly contested, and each of the parties concerned has some pretty good lawyers. The proximate danger with which we might start is the possibility of some sort of physical clash between maritime vessels of the countries involved or the air forces of some of the countries involved. There's potential for addressing this proximate danger, which then might allow for greater cooperation and conflict avoidance. There has been in Southeast Asia for a long time the idea of a code of conduct, but even the declaration about the code has not always been honored in the letter or in spirit. It would be much better to have a binding code, but it's not clear that that is going to be possible. The United States and China have actually taken an interesting step to develop their own bilateral code of conduct, in effect, for air forces and navies. If that could be proliferated throughout the region, that would be a good thing. I would also note that Taiwan's President Ma Ying-jeou has had generally positive ideas about how to address these issues, not just generally, across the board. China has resisted multilateral approaches, but one can hope that that would change over time. On to Taiwan. We understand that China has very much wanted to handle cross-strait relations as an issue simply between it and Taipei. It wishes to deal with Taipei from a position of strength with no U.S. interference. Taiwan likes to have U.S. help of different sorts. The difficulty that we have seen is that, first of all, Taiwan is divided over what mainland policy it should follow. Ma Ying-jeou, over the last 7 years, has pursued what I would call cautious engagement, mainly in the economic and cultural area. He understood from fairly early on the limits of moving towards political or security talks. One of those limits is public opinion on Taiwan. The other is the sort of central conceptual obstacle of the ROC and what it means. We will learn more in the weeks and months and maybe even the days ahead, Dr. Tsai's approach to mainland policy. Underlying the differences over policies are differences over identity, and there are a range of different identities that Taiwan people adopt. This is something that's been going on for 2 decades. Now, with respect to regional architecture, Taiwan is generally excluded, and this is a source of frustration to people on Taiwan. I think it also is counterproductive to Beijing's underlying political objective, and that's something it will have to address at some point. Finally, on Hong Kong, I'm just back from a visit to Hong Kong and talking to a number of people. The jury, I think, is still out on whether the Hong Kong government's current universal suffrage package will be adopted. The general sentiment is quite pessimistic. Some people say that they've talked to people who are optimistic, but it's hard to find them. I actually think the Hong Kong government's offer has some aspects of it that should be appealing to the pan-democrats, but the mistrust is so deep that it's hard to see how a political process could ensue that would lead to the package being adopted. So the effect will be that Beijing will not achieve its goal of moving forward on electoral reform. I think Beijing's basic problem is that over the last 25 years, Hong Kong has changed. The Hong Kong that China thought it was getting is not the Hong Kong that has emerged. Beijing saw it as simply an economic city, and it probably still would like to have an economic city only, but it's become a political city as well. Hong Kong is very happy to take the economic benefits that Beijing has provided over the last 12 years or so, but it also wants more political agency. Politics has moved from being a project of the Hong Kong elite to an arena for everyone. Moreover, there has been a radicalization of politics that complicates the effort to make progress. Another interesting thing that has happened, another change that has occurred since reversion, is the nature of identity among Hong Kong people, particularly young people. Polls in the mid-90s suggested that Hong Kong people saw themselves as Chinese. And since then, there's been an evolution. And some people still see themselves as Chinese only, but some now see themselves as Xiangangren only. And then there's mixtures of the two. You even have the emergence of Hong Kong independent sentiment. This was something that was very rare even during the British period, but the events of the last year have sort of stimulated this. Beijing has very much wanted to, as with Taiwan, make this an internal affair, something between it and the Hong Kong government and hopefully only the Hong Kong elite. It has taken an interesting step in this regard. It has proactively accused the United States of being the black hand behind the umbrella movement of last year, even though there's not any credible evidence to support that. I think, reflects the failure of its own policy, but also failure to understand the nature of the change that has occurred in Hong Kong over the last 15 or 20 years. Thank you.
Richard, in my eagerness to hear your opinion, I was very remiss. I forgot to point out, even though I'm sure almost everyone here knows, that you are not only the senior fellow at Brookings, and you are the chair of Taiwan Studies at Brookings. You also were the former head of the American Institute of Taiwan and a member of the National Intelligence Council. I was hoping I could ask a little bit more about the Taiwan issue.
Sure, please.
And you said that Taiwan has been excluded from much of the architectural initiatives, and I'm thinking specifically in Taiwan, there's a great desire to join TPP once and if it's actually concluded, but there's concern that that would not be possible unless China ascends as well, and that would invariably lead to a delay. And another issue is that the AIIB, Taiwan has wanted to join, but it has not been able to actually. Is that a problem? Obviously, these are issues for Taiwan itself. Is that an issue for the region as a whole?
It's a very good question. There are a lot of issues on which Taiwan has things to contribute to the solving of regional problems on a regional basis. And it's not just sort of financial resources, although those are important. It has its own experience. It also has a stake in some of these issues. Taiwan has weather, and so why shouldn't Taiwan be part of global meteorological interactions? Taiwan has two sort of major aircraft companies, passenger aircraft companies. So why shouldn't it play more of a role in ICAO? Taiwan has diseases. Is it enough that Taiwan attend the World Health Assembly once a year on the invitation of the Secretary General, who happens to be from Hong Kong? So I think the region loses by deferring to China on decisions of whether to include or exclude Taiwan. I think a way is going to be found, terminologically and other ways, for Taiwan to be a part of AIIB. On TPP, the basic question is, will it be possible to do a rerun of what we did for the accession of both Taiwan and the PRC, the WTO? That is possible. A lot of things have to happen before that becomes possible, including the reaching of an agreement on round one, but also Taiwan making a lot of domestic changes. But it's not out of the realm of possibility.
Thank you. All right, Satu. And Satu is the director of the East-West Center, okay. And he also was a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analysis, and he's also a former director of research at the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is part of the U.S. Pacific Command.
Thanks, Shihoko, and thanks, Jacques and Wilson Center and FPRI. It's a pleasure to be here today. In the sort of 12-ish, 13-ish minutes that we've been allotted, I was supposed to focus on Southeast Asia / ASEAN. And I couldn't help but think in my invitation and the title of this conference, I can think of no sub-region more blurry than Southeast Asia, which, as many of you will know, has been sliced and diced on cartographic maps and history books over time. Many of the maps that you can grow up looking at call Southeast Asia further India. It's split between India and China, between mainland Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia. So it fits in very much with this notion of identity. What I thought I'd do, simply because of the time, is talk about first the dynamics that I see in Southeast Asia, what's going on in the region. The second is to draw a link between those and the implications for regional institutions, economic and political. And third, end with a few comments on what I think U.S. equities and issues are as a result of these. On the dynamics, you can pick your dynamics. Here's my set of a few things to ponder. One is that like any place in the world, like any country in the world, the countries of Southeast Asia are going through a nation and state building process. This isn't static. I would say, to the extent that it's not unique, it's pronounced only in that these are still fairly recent post-colonial societies. They have incredibly intense and wide-ranging diversity. And their nation and state-building projects are going hand in hand with a very different project, which is essentially regional integration and community building, which is kind of a double whammy when you're going through nation-state building. The second dynamic, I think, is that the traditional leaders of the organization have moved off the stage. And so now you have a new generation of leaders emerging in the region, particularly the post-communist, the communist states of Southeast Asia, and a kind of diversity amongst the leadership which has undermined a sense of bonding or coherence that existed during its initial founding. The third dynamic I would draw your attention to is, because of Southeast Asia's growth rates and economic growth, it's a region that's integrating not only amongst the countries of Southeast Asia, but as part of the changes in the global production and supply chain, is beginning to integrate with Northeast Asia in particular, but also to a lesser extent with South Asia. So Southeast Asia's place along this continuum of the economic growth models of the 80s has now shifted into something very different, with all kinds of, not that I know the answer, but all kinds of very complicated implications for the architecture project, not to mention, which I'll come back to, TPP and RCEP. The fourth kind of dynamic is the changing balances of power within Southeast Asia. It's not clear to me that the kind of constellation of forces we saw in Southeast Asia over the last 20, 30 years is going to remain static. We've seen the relative rise of Vietnam. We've seen the emergence of democracy in a somewhat more articulated role of Indonesia. And so we're going to see that process continuing to work itself out. The fifth dynamic is the increasing internationalization of Southeast Asia. Where we're always talking about the rise of China, that's undeniable and absolutely true. But if you look at what's happened to the Republic of Korea over the last 2 decades, or the lower but still important rise of India, and the kind of emerging reemergence of Japan as a more activist actor since Prime Minister Abe took. So that has internationalized Southeast Asia in a way that Southeast Asia has not been internationalized before. And Australia, too, should not be forgotten in this role, and there's a lot of discussion in Australia about how to react, for example, onto the South China Sea. And the final dynamic, I would say, is there's a whole bunch of factors testing the unity and solidarity of ASEAN. Ambassador Stapleton Roy this morning, for those of you who were here, spoke about the need for ASEAN unity and solidarity as part of the regional management mechanism or the regional order-building project. And I would say that Southeast Asian unity and solidarity is being tested in a number of ways. The story's not done, but it's being tested by South China Sea, obviously. It's being tested by a whole range of overlapping and competing economic arrangements, One Belt, One Road, Maritime Silk Road, TPP, RCEP. The third, most recently, just because it's in the news, the migration issue of Rohingya going out of Bangladesh and obviously out of Myanmar. And then finally, because of the internationalization of Southeast Asia, the coherence and solidarity is also to some extent being tested because other external countries to Southeast Asia are beginning to, if you will, pick favorites, right? Countries are getting particularly close to Vietnam, or particularly close to Philippines, or particularly close to Malaysia, or what have you. So that has a way of jumbling the order and testing coherence. So if these are the propositions for the dynamics, the key dynamics occurring in Southeast Asia, what does this imply for order building, architecture building, whatever you want to call it? The first, of course, is that the domestic and nation-state building project in Southeast Asia is first order for the regime elites. And I use regime in the, whether it's the communist regimes or the UMNO regime or elites in different countries. I mean, building that domestic nation-state building project. Therefore, building ASEAN is the second priority, first of all. And more importantly, it's going to mean that there will be not a great amount of resources and effort given to institutionalizing ASEAN. We've seen this over and over in terms of giving money or personnel to ASEAN. Most countries don't want to cede it because the ASEAN project, in my view, in my personal view, is fundamentally not about intrusion on sovereignty, but the protection of sovereignty for post-colonial states. That's what the project is about. Which leads to the second issue is that how do you prevent intrusions on sovereignty? Well, one is given the constellation of forces around you, which is much stronger, much more powerful states, you claim centrality. As Ambassador Roy, as Ambassador Roy said, part of the reason that ASEAN can claim centrality is because of the big states around it. So it's claiming centrality, but because of the weakened coherence and the less cohesive leadership, it means that that claim is more and more in trouble, more and more in jeopardy, because great power dynamics around it are changing, which are challenging that order or that ability to claim centrality in the architectural process. The third implication for order and architecture, I think, is that the very internationalization that Southeast Asia sought to get, they purposefully reached out to ROK, to India, to Japan, to Australia, to China, for balancing each other off, for balancing countries off against themselves and getting the benefits. In some ways, as I always put it, Southeast Asia has never had it so good. Everyone's competing to provide public goods to Southeast Asia, to be Southeast Asia's friend. This is the first time since post-75 that's occurred at this level and this scale. But my view is that that very internationalization is now tipping over into a balance of strategic exposure. Now the very internationalization that kept the balance going in Southeast Asia has the danger of intruding strategic dilemmas onto Southeast Asia, whether that's Sino-Japan or Sino-Indian or U.S. China or ROK Japan is now spilling over or strategically exposing Southeast Asia. The fourth is that Southeast Asia thus far in its arguments has said that it's an arena or that it's a platform for great powers to meet. And it is, to some extent, on the sidelines of these meetings. People have, countries have bilaterals, and that's all a very useful and quite proper way to proceed. Being a platform is insufficient if the great powers are truly headed towards the kind of polarization that Gil is talking about. If indeed that is where things are headed, then that platform gets pretty shaky. And there's a lot of big elephants riding around that platform. And the fifth, of course, is something we've already talked about and won't belabor the issue, simply to point it out, that we now have, as again, to refer to Ambassador Roy's comments this morning, no black hats and white hats in terms of this order building project. Okay, there's a lot of proposals. One Belt, One Road, AAIB, Asia for Asians, CICA, TPP. I mean, these are multiple overlapping contestational orders. They are reflections of the underlying shifts in the balance of power that's going on in the region. What does this all mean for the United States? I think there are 5 issues that the United States needs to contend with. The first, of course, is this TPP issue. I have no idea whether TPP will pass or not pass, but regardless, it's an important issue because it goes to the heart of the economic order. I couldn't help but be intrigued with Shihoko's question about Taiwan, because Taiwan may well want to be part of TPP, which makes a lot of eminent sense. But if you do some of the modeling and some of the number crunching, it may well be 47% of your trade is with China. Your benefits won't accrue in the short term from TPP. They'll accrue from being in RCEP. So there are lots of ways that countries are going to have to think about what matters to them. For the United States on TPP versus non-TPP order is simply this, to my mind, is that for Southeast Asia, what about the countries in Southeast Asia who are not party to TPP negotiations and are not going to be party to TPP negotiations anytime soon because they're not at that economic stage of development? So you only have Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam, and one can, think very hard about, whether they are at the same level of economic development capable to join TPP. But what do you do with the others? Now, we have enhanced economic engagement. There's always been these proposals for U.S.-ASEAN FTA, which I think under the current environment of trade negotiations and trade agreements in our system, in the United States congressional system, is highly unlikely. You have LMI. So the first policy dilemma is, how do you bridge the gap, and I'm not talking about the rest of the region for the moment, in Southeast Asia between TPP members and non-TPP members? How do you bring the others up to scale and therefore not create kind of different tiers of economic development? I think it's possible to do with the right policy tools, but I think it's an issue that has to be dealt with. The second issue is South China Sea, of course. And only to say in the big scheme of things why this is a dilemma to order building is much of U.S. approach has been, to my mind, carefully calibrated between what China should do, what ASEAN should do, what U.S. and China, what ASEAN and PRC should do together, namely code of conduct, and what the U.S. should do. These are the 4 kind of calibrations of our policy approach to handling the South China Sea. It seems to me, anyways, that current conditions are driving towards a more U.S.-China contestation over South China Sea, which makes the ASEAN position and the Southeast Asian position much harder to calibrate than it was maybe a year ago or 18 months. But this is a highly evolving, very fluid process, so I couldn't tell you what this might look like in 6 months or 3 months or 1 month. The third issue for the U.S., I think, is to calibrate or sort of weight regional institutions that are ASEAN-led versus those that are not ASEAN-led. Most of the ones we talk about, whether it's East Asia Summit or ARF or ADMM+, or ASEAN itself are obviously ASEAN-led institutions. But as you know, in the context of the pivot, in terms of the tools and mechanics for U.S. managing of Asia-Pacific order, allies and emerging partners are tools too. So where does regional institutions fit within the matrix of tools that we have to deal with the emerging order? And it seems to me that ASEAN-led institutions are now in a period of less stable footing, as it were, less grounded footing than they were maybe when we joined initially as part of the pivot. Not to mention there are other other tools, the bilaterals and the trilaterals that Gil referred to, et cetera. The fourth dilemma is a very sort of policy wonkish one, but worth mentioning. Part of the contestation between ASEAN and the U.S. is about what to do about EAS, which reflects a larger kind of problematic, which is this an ASEAN +6 institution within the region, that is to say, on that side of the Pacific, or are there trans-Pacific arrangements? And obviously countries like China and others would prefer to see much more Asia-focused organizations and orders, and we would prefer to see much more trans-Pacific, open, inclusive orders. And that battle plays itself out. So you see this contestation in the ASEAN +3 versus the EAS process. And the U.S. has consistently, both under Secretary of State Clinton and under the current Secretary of State, Mr. Kerry, have argued for a key set of issues to be dealt with in EAS, and that the EAS become the premier forum providing strategic guidance to the other institutions. Well, that runs up into ASEAN centrality. So that's an issue that we will have to deal with. And the final issue that I would say that we have to kind of calibrate in terms of U.S. policy is global versus regional issues. Now, I don't want to draw too fine a distinction. It's not that terrorism or climate change or a whole bunch of transnational issues don't implicate Southeast Asia. They very much do. But Southeast Asia, as I said, for the reasons of nation and state building and for unity, solidarity, and coherence within the region, there's always going to be a bit of a tussle between signing up to U.S. priorities, global priorities, versus doing their own agenda. And you see this in the EAS legacy issues versus the issues we'd like to deal with, which are much more, if you will, realpolitik issues, non-proliferation, balance of power, maritime security. So this kind of contestation will also have to be balanced out. And those are the five challenges. Now, I know it's very fashionable at this particular juncture in analysis to have a kind of a bleak view of all of this, that there really are choices to be made, and these choices are fundamental, and to some extent that's true. But none of these things are completely mutually exclusive. I mean, it is quite possible to go along with the TPP process while going along with very slow-moving RCEP negotiations. It is possible to have an aspiration for a one belt, one road integrating principle while Japan continues to pursue an east-west corridor for linking their global and production supply chains all across the Southeast Asian quadrant all the way down into southern India. I mean, these are not mutually incompatible. They're not mutually entirely exclusive. It's a question of how much effort, resources, attention, and policy push you give to them. So I think it's entirely manageable. Let me just end there. Thanks.
So with that very cautiously optimistic note, we've covered a lot of ground, so I'm hoping we can take a few questions, unless you want to comment on each other's comments. Okay. If you could wait for a microphone, and if you could also identify yourself, it would be greatly appreciated. So why don't we start? The lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Ting, and I'm an intern at the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center. And my question is addressed to Mr. Gilbert Rosman. You mentioned at the end of your talk about the 6 dimensions of national identity, and I would really like to hear you identify that. And my second question would just be, in your opinion, what makes some country more successful in establishing a sense of national identity in its citizens than other countries? And because in my opinion, I've always felt that in Western countries, such as the U.S., generally speaking, they've been more successful in establishing national identity in its diverse populations than, say, East Asian countries such as China. Thank you.
Answer now. Okay, the six dimensions, very briefly, came out in a series of 3 books that were published through the.
They're on sale on Amazon.
They all were co-published with the Woodrow Wilson Center here. Part of my stay here was working on them, and they deal with the ideological dimension, which was dominant during the period of traditional communism, the history dimension, how history is viewed today in various periods to boost your own sense of distinctiveness and superiority, what I call the sectoral dimension, combining economic national identity, cultural national identity, and political national identity. The sense of, the fourth one is what I call the vertical dimension, which is how you treat the role of your state versus your ethnic groups versus your civil society. What is within your society, how do you identify the strength of the state? And here in East Asia, all the countries I look at have a very state-centered, dominant national identity. International relations, view of the international community and the regionalism and your willingness to cooperate with other countries. And finally, there's a intensity dimension. How strongly does this identity come up? And that relates to your last point. You seem to be asking, how do you inculcate the national identity versus ethnic identity versus sort of within country identities. And here I see in Russia, in China, in Japan, in Korea, the 4 countries I study intensely, that they've all got such a state-centered identity that there's no room really for ethnic identity. That is, if you want to try to develop ethnic identity, you're doing it as opposed to the national identity. They're not, and they just sort of run roughshod over these other types of identities, assuming that there'll be such strength of the state, and they build it up through all these other dimensions, the history, the ideology, and so on, that the state is just fantastic. It's the salvation. And by symbols and by crises, this seems to work very well.
I'm Bob Hathaway here at the Wilson Center. I want to talk, or get our panelists to talk about European institutions as a model for the creation of effective institutions in Asia. I think either explicitly or at least implicitly, when people talk about architecture building in Asia, they have, at least in part, some of the institutions that were created in Europe at a time when confrontation between what used to be called East and West was taking place. And indeed, one of Asia's oldest institutions, ASEAN, was also created in the context of the Cold War. So my question is, can effective institutions in Asia be created at a time when, as several speakers have said during the day, the lines seem to be hardening within the region? Is Europe, or are European institutions an example to be emulated, or is Europe really provides an example to guard against?
That's a massive question, Bob, and difficult. I was struck that Ambassador Roy said this morning that big changes in institutional structure or orders come after great conflict. The really big ones, and even ASEAN during the late '60s, '67, '68. That's not, Cold War wasn't that kind. It wasn't World War II. It was a Cold War, and it was certainly not the best of situations, but it wasn't that great cataclysm of conflict. And so Southeast Asia, at least for the Southeast Asians that I speak to and hear from, they don't think their process needs to be driven in the same way. It doesn't come out of those origins. Second, the cultural context, I don't know if that's the right word, I'm not a scholar of institutions, but the cultural context of these institutions and norm building is very different, I think, than Europe or than it is in Southeast Asia. You know, the much derided ASEAN way of consensus and non-interference and slow movement seems to still work for Southeast Asians in terms of their comfort level. Now, whether it works for managing regional order is another issue, but it works for how they want to manage their institutions. So in that way, I'm suggesting Europe is not seen as an immediately viable or useful model. And third is that, if just in recent times, Russia and Ukraine, the Greek debt, the migrants in Southern Europe. I don't think my ASEAN friends or Southeast Asian friends look to that model and say, wow, that's working out really well. We want to replicate that. That's good for us. And having just come back from London, meeting with a whole bunch of military and diplomatic folks from around Europe in London, I will tell you, we talk about Asians' interest in European models, but it's quite interesting to see how hand-wringing there is in Europe now about their own models and their own structures for managing the dilemmas. So those are sort of three responses I would have.
I have a bit of a response here using this 2-month cycle that preoccupies me. Angela Merkel went to Japan, and was that a possibility to learn from Germany, with Japan, with all its tensions with South Korea and others? No, it was a bad visit because Japanese weren't ready for that at all. They didn't respond well. But meanwhile, I think we have institutions in Asia that could have worked, but they have been blocked. They failed. I think, for instance, the six-party talks, wonderful institution, if the countries could have simply agreed on how to proceed and understood that if North Korea violated the basic principles, it would be 5 versus 1. But China and Russia did not want 5 versus 1. They were too supportive of North Korea to allow a regional security mechanism to emerge, or to talk about security, and it collapsed. Or you could take the China, Japan, Korea CJK, and they set up a secretariat, they talked about an FTA, and so on. And yet that blew apart too. That's not going anywhere. And so they create the institutions, but the will doesn't exist. And I don't think that has anything to do with the European model. I think it's because there are countries in this region that are against these kinds of multilateral institutions because they have other objectives in mind.
I don't really have anything to add.
Why don't we take
Michael? Michael Yehuda, currently with George Washington University. I would like to suggest that this concern with multilateral institutions really is something that is indicative of Western ways of thinking. I think neither by history nor by recent examples can one say that institutions or multilateral institutions have really played that much of a role in shaping what people call the security architecture. I would even suggest that even as far as economics are concerned, they're not the economic relationships that have emerged in East Asia, but also in Asia more generally, may have had some of the language of dealing of somehow run by the state, but essentially they have not been. They've been run by big companies on the whole, looking for ways to work with other centers for their own mutual advantages in terms of lines of production where they will go from here to there. What we focus on in terms of trade and trade statistics is in many respects misleading, because a lot of the trade is really involving the intra-movements of goods and other matters by some of these big companies, and even the smaller ones. in Southeast Asia and China are really driven very much by family-owned companies. The emergence of China on the road to economic growth and so on really started through the various connections involving what we sometimes call overseas Chinese firms and so on. So in many respects, the cooperation that is effective in Asia is more through informal processes rather than highly formalized ones. And I think that we can see this very clearly in the ways in which Xi Jinping has proposed new kinds of order, both regional and more broadly. The way in which the Taiwan issue is dealt with is dealt very much on informal processes that then can be built up into other forms. And China doesn't really have a tradition of establishing Westphalian-type relationships involving alliances. And most of these have either come, like ASEAN did, to not to erode sovereignty, but to strengthen it. And this came from the ending of the confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia, and was designed, therefore, to help to consolidate themselves against external pressures. And there isn't really the tradition of, say, the European one, in which it was felt that they have a tradition of coming up with new multilateral arrangements after major wars.
Or maybe if I
Don't
could,
have that in Asia.
if I could add a little bit to that, maybe Asian nations have reached a point today where, in order to counterbalance China within the region, there is no option but to have some sort of architecture to bring them together against Beijing. Is that one way of looking at it, to see a need rather than some kind of more broader European style? It's connected by philosophy of the end of the World War II and more about necessity.
Well, I think I think you're onto something. A lot of the architecture that was created in Europe after the Second World War was done under the shadow of the Soviet Union, which was an existential threat to all the countries concerned. I'd actually look at it a different way, and that is that sort of since World War II, Asia has never existed as a self-contained unit. That the United States has always been there as a resident power, and the United States structured economic, security, and other kinds of relationships and sort of set the cues for everybody else. Now, that has come under challenge at various times. It's under a new sort of challenge, and whether we adjust to changing circumstances in a way that keeps us in the region as the resident power is really up to our own capacity and will. If we decide that this isn't a game we want to play, there will be some other solution to it. But I think that the dare I say, dominance of the United States in all of this has been an impediment in the creation of Asia-specific institutions for addressing Asian problems.
I have a different perspective. I see that China is seeking to build such institutions. The SCO is likely to expand, and China really wants to strengthen it, and Russia is now reducing its reluctance to have this China-centered organization be strengthened. We'll see where that can go. In the meantime, the U.S. is clearly trying to build something beyond hubs and spokes. There's a lot going on right now in building up a security system, and Korea is under the pressure for a stronger trilateralism in security with Japan. Australia has become much more active, and we're all waiting to see what India's big new step is. So there's a great movement going on right now, apart from the existing ASEAN-centered institutions.
Yeah, as I said, there are a number of institutions, and I would just note here that in some sense the U.S. has docked onto Asian multilateralism after the fact. I mean, we didn't join EAS at the beginning. We came in, I think, in the 5th year or 7th year, or exactly, I don't remember. But so it's not really a Western construct. We were in part motivated to join, I think, by what a lot of our allies and friends in the region said, which is things are changing here. We are developing new structures, and we want to institutionalize U.S. presence and reassurance here. And one of these things is by participating in these organizations. And so I think that has been a part of the narrative as well.
I can get the gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Dong Hui with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. My question is for Richard. And what kinds of role that the U.S. expect Taiwan to play in the South China Sea in the context of the increasing strategic competition between China and the U.S.? What do you expect to hear from Dr. Tsai, who is visiting the U.S., in this regard? And in another word, between the closer cooperation from Taiwan with the U.S. in the South China Sea and the stability of the cross-strait relations, which one is more important for the U.S. interest? Thank you.
Well, I don't know what Dr. Tsai is going to say this week, so without facts, it's pretty hard for me to speculate on that. With respect to the South China Sea, I think the principles that President Ma has enunciated are ones that are pretty consistent with the approach that the United States has taken, and so that is good. I would note that the Republic of China occupies the one landform in the South China Sea that definitely is an island. There are probably others, but Taiping Island definitely qualifies. But I think cross-strait relations are probably a lot more important for the United States in the grand scheme of things than what Taiwan does in the South China Sea.
Thanks for your enlightening discussion. Jennifer Chen, reporter with Shenzhen Media Group, one of major TV network in China. I just wonder what's your take on China's new white paper, especially regarding to the emphasis on the maritime preparation for military struggle. And also, I wonder what's your take on the recent water disputes on South China Sea. Does it have any impact to the overall U.S.-China relations? Thanks.
Did you read the white paper? I didn't read it.
I have been out of the country focused on other things, so I'm not in a position to answer. Sorry.
I haven't read the white paper carefully. I've seen some references to it, so that's not my issue. As far as the water disputes in the South China Sea, I mean, this is clearly a big blow to Sino-U.S. relations, and I think the challenge is to keep this blow from interfering with the momentum for the security and economic dialogue in the summer and the visit by President Xi in the fall or in September. So I think that this is creating the impression that things are we've had a very downward slide, and the momentum achieved in November, when there was a sense of more cooperation and common interest between the United States and China, has been lost. It'll be hard to regain that momentum.
And I think that has an important impact on the region. I mean, the region watches very carefully how we manage the U.S. Both sides manage the U.S. China relationship. And so the region is also waiting very carefully to see how the next steps of this S&E dialogue, but also the Xi visit, of whether the things that, for example, Richard was talking about, the bilateral agreements we're trying to do, kind of a code of conduct between U.S. and China, at least, to how to handle our behaviors at sea and in the air, are worked on simultaneously with these disagreements. And so this has huge ramifications for the region and how the region responds and what calculations they therefore make. So I think it's enormous.
Speaking of bilateral visits, President Park Geun-hye is coming. There's a lot of interest in not just the Korean media, but the Japanese media, Asian media in general. How would you define the success of her visit to the United States? There's already quite a lot of concern about keeping up with Abe. This, of course, is a working level visit. It's not an official state visit. She's already had that. But given that, what are some of the things that would make her look good?
I think that's a critical question right now as we're preparing for that visit. I think the first thing is that we want to do as much as possible not to make this a comparison between Park and Abe. It's not a zero-sum game where one wins and one loses, and that's the way the history issue has been portrayed, particularly in Korea. So that I think that there should be, and I think the U.S. has been very vigorous in preparing for this over a few months, thinking of both visits simultaneously and trying to get both countries to do things that'll make the two visits complementary rather than at odds with each other. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, I think this is a visit about North Korea, that worsening danger from North Korea, and so to try to separate that problem from the South China Sea, not to try to create an atmosphere of division between South Korea and China, but to try to create an atmosphere where South Korea and the United States are working together to try to create to deal with North Korea's worsening threat. Now, if it's realistic, it has to say, what is the increasing danger of what China and Russia might have in mind with North Korea? How can we broaden the context? How can we narrow the divide with them? But really, the theme is going to be much more deterrence than reopening negotiations, because few have any optimism about the negotiations. So it's really going to be strengthening the deterrence in case North Korea takes some kind of extreme action, perhaps in preparation for its October celebration of its 70th anniversary of the establishment of the ruling party. So I think that this is going to be a security summit above all. There'll be talk about maybe some momentum after TPP, but it's hard to proceed with uncertainty there. And, of course, emphasis on shared values. And I think that there will be a good sense to this meeting, because the more complicated issues of how South Korea can straddle China and the United States are likely to be buried.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would only note that South Korean leaders have spoken to a joint session of the U.S. Congress 5 times.
Right. She did that last time. She will not speak.
Yeah, she will not speak.
All right.
Excuse me, Marvin Ott, Wilson Center. Excuse me. First of all, marvelous panel. It's really, with the principles involved, no surprise, but very rich. Quick cue on particularly a couple comments that Satu made, And just a broad gauge question observation. On the one hand, as Satu and others portrayed, this region, particularly Southeast Asia, is extremely dynamic, extremely rich, extremely variegated, multiple levels of interactive complexity that just get deeper and deeper. Taking that as your baseline, we then inject what's a emerging face-off between the U.S. and China in the South China Sea. As a risking sounding like a one-trick pony, I think this is going to be and is becoming big time. And so I'm wondering, almost in a kind of international relations theoretical sense, what happens when you inject a big-time bilateral, increasingly militarized face-off between two great powers into an environment that has been defined by complexity, interactivity, multiple positive sum relationships, and so on?
Well, given the theme of this conference, I was thinking about this, national sub-regional orders in East Asia, blurring borders, I can't help but think it comes back to something that Richard just pointed out. I think one of your points was, if I forget, maritime Asia. Mm-hmm. I'm always thinking of blurring borders and the history, and we're still talking about East Asia. But this whole continuum of maritime Asia, for 500 years ran from the Indian Ocean through East Asia. So we're returning and seeing, I think, a pattern of contestation and playing out of great power politics across this whole, what Mike McDivitt in his project on the long littoral called, this long littoral that essentially runs from the Gulf up to the Northeast Asian sphere. So I don't want to, it's too broad of a canvas to draw certain things, but one of the big disjunctures or disconnects analytically that I have not found a way to think about properly is there's this very traditional great power rivalry and contestation across the littoral of maritime Asia. But simultaneously, there's a very different integration process of production and supply chains across that maritime Asia. And how do you manage the two? And that's where the question of these overlapping and competing orders. And that's why I say I'm cautiously optimistic that they're not zero-sum games, that they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, it's very telling to me that all of the countries that are engaged in South China Sea disputes decided to join AIIB. Then none of them have wanted to give up certain economic arrangements with people they're in contestation with on territory and other things. So I think you're going to see, as again, sorry to refer again to the fine talk by Ambassador Roy, but you're going to see an era in which there are going to be things working at many levels. It's not going to be as simple as the sort of key 50 years of the Cold War phase. And I don't, I remain that these are manageable things through adequate policy. I don't think they have to end in tears, but I think it's going to take an awful lot more thinking and work than we've given it so far.
In that regard, Marvin, we all talk about how our friends in Southeast Asia want both China and the United States in the region, and they don't want to have to make a choice. They don't want to have to choose between security and economics. And what is interesting to me is the way in which the recent train of events may sort of force that choice or make that choice more sort of pressing, and whether our friends in the region sort of will push back against both Beijing and Washington to say, no, this isn't how we wanted the game to be played. Second, it occurs to me that what we have seen in the last couple of weeks may not necessarily have been directed by the national command authority of both countries. That perhaps what we are seeing is sort of the operation of subordinate parts of the two governments who believe quite sincerely that they're acting in the national interest, as they define it, but that once this happens, it leads the leaders of the two countries to say, no, this wasn't how we wanted the game to play out, and perhaps greater sort of top-down control can be exercised, which I think makes me wish that it was Xi Jinping who's coming to Washington in 2 weeks and not President Park Geun-hye.
We have time for one brief question and a brief answer. Jacques.
Jacques Delisle, FPRI. Satu largely answered this, but I wanted to get the other panelists' take on this. As you get this proliferation recently of new institutional structures, one story is 100 flowers, a diverse ecology, we can send different problems, different areas. But what do Gil and Richard think about the possibility, especially of more rivalrous arrangements? And this is something Ambassador Roy talked about as well, that by having more, we actually wind up having less because each becomes a vehicle for China and the U.S. principally, and perhaps others, to push their agendas. And secondly, Richard talked about the attempt to keep Hong Kong and Taiwan as essentially bilateral subnational issues in the Chinese view. How does the proliferation of institutions you've been talking about, including the new Chinese initiatives, how does that square with China's longstanding and still not abandoned position that the really big disputes, the territorial ones especially, should be handled informally and bilaterally and not through institutions or legal processes?
I think I understand the question. On the second part, I think China would definitely prefer and perhaps insist on handling or addressing territorial disputes only among the countries that are claimants to this particular piece of territory. And if it's two countries, then it would be bilateral and so on. But the necessity, I think, on other aspects of these disputes, particularly how maritime vessels operate in the South China Sea, has to be on a multilateral basis, I think, because a lot of different countries are doing it. Now, whether it should have to be ASEAN for Southeast Asia, I don't know, because some ASEAN states are claimants and others aren't. Some have a big stake in the outcome, others don't. Perhaps this should be done on a sort of a more disaggregated basis, I guess. I come back to my definition of institutions as problem solvers, and I think in the end the answer to your first question is which institutions, if any, do the best job of solving the problems concerned. It may be that none of the institutions involved will do a very good job, and other ways will be found to deal with the problems concerned. Maybe some will prove themselves appropriate for the issues that they're trying to address.
My response here is that I think that right now, Abe and Putin are particularly pushing hard for more polarized institutions, that they are eager to drag or encourage their partners to understand that this divide is a very sharp one, and that I would say Obama and Xi are holding open the possibility that they will find a lot of areas of cooperation, whether it's climate change or Iran, and that they will have a more nuanced approach while they're still competing and building up the rivalry with each other in response to particular crises. And so a lot depends on how we deal with some of these issues, how the serious divides are handled in the coming months. North Korea always and now we add the South China Sea to that issue. So I think we're still at a crossroads where things aren't decided, but it will be very difficult to reverse the downward momentum that I see developing recently.
Well, I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Gil?
Richard?
Thanks, Gil. Great to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thanks so much for coming.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shihoko.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
Ambitious.